Hello, and welcome to Development Reimagines Decolonizing Development video series. My name is Ivory Kairo, and I work as a Policy Analyst and Communications Assistant at Development Reimagined. In this series, we seek to provide an insight into what it means to decolonize development. What results will this have? What does change look like? And how do we, in all parts of the world, whatever racial, gender, disciplinary, social, or other background, drive change? We have seen that development, health, and humanitarian organizations of various sizes are reflecting, becoming more transparent of these issues and recognizing the need for rebalancing. But what next? How do we change a buzzword into real, tangible action? If you don't already know, Development Reimagined is a leading, independent and African-led international development consultancy, with our headquarters in China and with offices in Kenya and the UK. Our mission is to provide new ideas and solutions to deal with the complexities of global poverty and climate change. And this is a mission our diverse team really strives for every day. For this reason, I am very excited to have our distinguished guest, Lorriann Robinson, who will share some insights on one of the key themes of what it means to decolonize development: reparations. But first, what do we at Development Reimagined mean by reparations? We define reparations as compensation in money or material for losses and damages sustained during or after hostilities, be it intentional or otherwise, and payable by aggressor nations to oppressed nations.
Lorriann Robinson is the perfect person to help us look into this. Lorriann is the founder and director of the Advocacy Team, a consultancy who, in her words, helps organizations who are looking to influence advocacy decisions and policy decisions, especially related to global development. All our clients are mission-focused and working on social justice issues, and we cover a broad scope of issues and everything from global health to climate, nature, clean air for the full spectrum. Lorriann has worked at the Fabian Society, a political think tank affiliated to the UK Labour Party, for NGOs such as Barnardo's, the NSPCC, World Vision, and the One Campaign. At the latter, she played a leading role in the campaign to bring the 0.7% aid target into UK law. Fast forward to her current role, and now she and her team are involved in a very specific project looking at reparations, and especially in relation to the transatlantic slavery. So without further ado, I'd like to kick off with our first question. How are reparations different from aid?
I think reparations is different in three important ways. One is it requires a period of reflection to understand how a country, an institution, I think even individual families have harmed somebody else. Two, it requires a commitment to atone for those wrongdoings. And then in three, it requires actually putting that commitment to atone into practice. And in line with the definition you shared, that means contributing to repair the damage that has been caused, whether through financial means or through other ways.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And building on this, could you share some examples of reparations in practice?
Yes. So there is a longer history of reparations as being part of the system for international negotiations, especially after wars and harms. And actually what makes transatlantic slavery unique is the fact that the call for justice and for reparations has gone on for so long because it has been ignored. But you can take, for example, the payments that Germany made to the UK after World War I as an example of reparations. Actually, the Prime Minister Liz Truss has called for Russia to pay reparations to Ukraine. So there are many examples where governments are comfortable with the use of reparations. You could maybe take the example of the payments that Germany made to Namibia in acknowledgement of their contribution to a genocide in that country. They didn't use the term reparations, they used the term reconciliation, but it's arguably within that spirit. And then in the US, there are more examples, some more kind of practical examples of institutions, especially churches, who were linked to plantations and who have identified the descendants of enslaved people and made monetary and financial contributions to those people. So there are many examples, both at the state and non-state levels. There are definitely, in my experience and in my reading, fewer examples of that here in the UK. Professor Hilary Beckles talks about a research and run. So many, so far, UK institutions have been kind of doing the first part of examining their history and kind of accepting their role and maybe even apologizing, but we're not seeing so far really tangible examples of meaningful reparations, but it's something to continue to advocate for sure.
What development purposes should reparations be directed to, and why?
I mean, I think that's the question for the people who have been harmed or the people who descend and face the consequences of that harm. And I think it will look very different in each place. But in the Caribbean context, which is the one that I have been working on most closely, when I've talked to people, they have talked about a set of issues that traditionally fall outside of our thinking about development. So they've talked about some of the social impacts of that legacy. So issues around colorism and the importance of promoting a positive African identity within those countries. They've talked about issues related to land rights for the poorest people whose families moved off plantations and never secured titles and tenancies and never secured proper land rights, which continue to hold them back. So I think that there's scope for reparations to address a really broad spectrum of issues that are directly linked to the legacy. But I also think it's completely valid for reparations to be utilized for kind of development purposes and for economic transformation. And ultimately, that will be a negotiation and discussions for the community affected.
How could we equitably distribute reparations?
Yes, it's a difficult question. And for me, I would say that you should look firstly at the people who continue to bear the brunt of that legacy most closely, those who have found it more difficult to move away from that legacy. So, I gave that example of people who were unable to secure land rights very early because their families moved away from plantations and who are still struggling to access secure tenancies. I think that's a really practical example. So if I were to be blunt, I would say, the kind of poorest and marginalized groups who still are being held back because of that legacy, and where you can see that connection most closely. That's not to say that others have not been held back and are not affected by the legacy, but I think it is often possible to see a more direct and a more direct link, and to see how that legacy is having a more substantial hold on some people. But equally, I think these are questions and discussions that need to be just negotiated and discussed. And the important thing is that every group has a meaningful opportunity to contribute to those discussions. And it would be a real travesty if discussions about what happens with financing from reparations are made solely by a political elite, and that the interests and views and ideas of the most marginalized are ignored.
That's a very good explanation and a very good answer for the questions. And our last question is, how can we incentivize global North organizations and leadership to establish reparation systems?
Yeah, so I think the language of reparations needs to be much more prominent in campaigning, and I think I see some of that growing, but it is still niche groups who are advocating for reparations, and I would love to see a stronger groundswell among civil society, especially in the global North. So in the global South, there are really active civil society organizations. Having said that, many of the organizations that have led the movements for reparations in Europe, they have tended to be, in my experience, smaller organizations, often diaspora-led organizations, sometimes doing that work on the basis of volunteer labor and through blood, sweat and tears. And there's a lot that can be done to just support those initiatives and to support those organizations and that work. And I think it's just old-fashioned campaigning and just making the case. And there is definitely a sense within the community that this is the time, that this is the moment. And so I think it's just kind of keeping at it, because we've been having these conversations for a very long time.
Thank you very much, Lorriann, for joining us today and for having this discussion with us. And we have definitely gained a lot of food of thought, and we greatly appreciate you taking your time to speak with us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.